Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon for our very first Articulate for the series. We're really excited to have you here for the next hour, and we really hope you're going to enjoy the exciting talk that we have lined up for you. Before we kick things off and I introduce our fantastic speakers for this afternoon, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're coming to you from today. So I'd like to recognise and pay respects to the elders and communities, past, present and emerging, of the lands on where the University of Sydney campuses currently stand. For thousands of years, they have shared and exchanged knowledge across innumerable generations for the benefit of all. So our program for this evening, we'll do a little bit of an introduction, a bit of housekeeping, then we'll have our presentation. So our first start of the presentation will be from Dr. Christian Gillitzer, and he's going to chat about economics, macroeconomics and fiscal challenges. We've got Darren Svanfelds, our International Programs Coordinator, who's going to discuss the Bachelor of Economics. There'll be some time at the end for Q&A, and then we'll send you through a link to do some evaluation. So feel free to put any questions that you have as we're going through the presentations today into the Q&A, and our team will be happy to answer them for you towards the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded and we will be able to send it to you after the presentation today. If you do have any questions, we've got an email address up on the screen at the moment. Feel free to send us any questions after the session today as well. So I'd love to now introduce you to our fantastic speakers who we have with us here this evening. So our first speaker is Dr. Christian Gillitzer. He's a senior lecturer in the School of Economics at the University of Sydney and a visiting fellow at ANU's Tax and Transfer Policy Institute. His research covers public economics and macroeconomics. He's the co-author of the textbook Tax Systems, published by MIT Press, and he received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan in 2013. Also joining us this evening, we have Mr. Darren Svanfelds, who is the International Program Coordinator for the Strategic Partnerships and Engagement team within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So Darren coordinates our dual degree, Sciences Po France application cycles, and he looks after this since taking over the role in 2021. So Darren was previously with the Communications and Administration Coordinator at the School of Languages and Cultures. So I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Christian Gillitzer. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks, Charlotte. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today and discuss macroeconomic and fiscal challenges. So Charlotte's already provided an introduction. Just to mention a few more things. So I joined the University of Sydney in 2017. My teaching is closely related to the topic that I'll be discussing today. So in particular, I teach both public economics and macroeconomics, two closely related fields. They're also my research fields as well, so I conduct research in those areas. Prior to joining the University of Sydney, I was an economist at the Reserve Bank of Australia. I started there on the graduate program following doing an economics degree at the University of Melbourne. I worked there for a number of years, for a decade, and in the final role there, my job was analysing data, some of the data we're going to be seeing today, so the labour market and inflation, so prices on average in the economy. So let me start with a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going today. So what I want to discuss first is the current and sort of near-term macroeconomic conditions. And so that's the outlook for the economy and the outlook that's sort of shaping the budget and confronting our policymakers at the moment in putting the budget together. Next, I want to turn to the outlook for the Commonwealth budget. So the budget will be delivered for the 2023-24 financial year in just under 2 weeks from now. So on Tuesday, the 9th of May. So this will be the second budget for the new Albanese government. So I don't know and I can't speculate what's going to be in the budget, but what we can do today is look a little bit beyond the immediate horizon and get a sense of what are the sort of broader forces shaping the budget and the policymakers are confronting. So we'll begin by talking about how the budget position and its appropriateness given the current business cycle and what the government might be trying or should be trying to do. Next, we'll move on and look at debt or fiscal sustainability. So are we on a sustainable path under current policy settings? Then I want to dig a little deeper into that. So look at the components of the federal government budget position. So the revenues and expenditures underlying the expected deficits in the years to come. We'll see then that the plausibility and the desirability of those paths have implications for the tax structure that we're likely to face, and then we'll see how that compares with other countries. So putting Australia's tax structure in international perspective. So that's a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going. So I want to begin talking about macroeconomic conditions by looking at the unemployment rate. So if there could be one single timely indicator of the macroeconomy, the unemployment rate would have to be up there as an important one to look at. So what does the unemployment rate show? As you may have learned, it's the percentage of the labour force who are available and actively seeking work, but who are unable to find work. And the labour force in turn is the sum of the employed and the unemployed. So what does the unemployment rate tell us about? As a macroeconomist, it tells us the rate of labour utilisation in the economy. So if you look at a period where the economy in bad times, which is a recession, which we had in the early 1980s and the early 1990s, you can see the unemployment rate was very high, exceeding 10%. So many people who want to and are available to work but couldn't find work. Underutilisation of labour resources, the economy producing below capacity. More recently, you can see this spike here. This was COVID. So during the pandemic, where we had restrictions imposed, the unemployment rose noticeably, although not nearly as high as in earlier downturns, those major recessions in the early 80s and early 1990s. That was in large part due to extraordinary fiscal support and monetary support that government put in place. Now, we're at the point where the unemployment rate is now around 3.5%, is at historically low levels. In fact, it's the lowest levels for around 50 years. So we're in a somewhat unique position now with an extraordinarily low unemployment rate. So we're close to close or perhaps even above what we might term full employment. The next macroeconomic indicator I want to turn to looking at is inflation, in particular CPI or Consumer Price Index inflation. So this is a measure of the average price of goods and services that consumers such as you and me pay to buy things in the economy. So it won't represent the average change in price, the change in prices for any one of us individually, but it'll be an average for all of us. So what this graph shows is the annual percentage change or change over the year in the average price level for that basket of goods and services bought by the average consumer. At the moment, inflation is very high. So this graph here shows inflation at 7.8%. In fact, we've got that's extraordinarily high level compared to our history over the past few decades. I put together these slides late last week, but you may have noticed if you've been following the economic news, that some new data were released for inflation just yesterday by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The inflation rate has fallen a little from 7.8 to 7%, still a very high level nonetheless. What I've shaded here, this shaded band here between 2 and 3%, is what's called the Reserve Bank of Australia's target band. So that part of the Reserve Bank of Australia's mandate is to keep inflation at a low and stable level. And that is interpreted as keeping inflation between 2 to 3% on average over time. You can see looking back since 1993, when this target for monetary policy was originally introduced, the Reserve Bank has done a good job at keeping inflation between 2 and 3%. There have been periods when it's exceeded and when it's been below the target band, but on average it's been close to 2.5%, so the midpoint of that target band. What we're experiencing now is the biggest deviation from the target band and the most persistent deviation over the inflation targeting period since 1993. So this is a significant policy challenge for the Reserve Bank and macroeconomic policymakers and the federal government more generally. So why is inflation high? Well, it reflects a few things. One, as a result of the pandemic, there were disruptions to supply chains. So you may have read about this. Secondly, there's a high level of demand in the economy. That's reflected in the low level of the unemployment rate. So the combination of supply disruptions, so the supply curve, aggregate supply curve shifting to the left, and strong demand, a legacy of the extraordinary fiscal and monetary support that was put in place during COVID, has resulted in a very high level of inflation. So what's the Reserve Bank been doing in order to try to lower inflation back to its 2 to 3% target band? So the RBA has engaged since April 2022 in an extraordinarily large and fast increase in interest rates. So in the so-called cash rate, which is the short-term interest rate policy rate that's set by the Reserve Bank. So this is the fastest increase in the cash rate over the inflation targeting period since 1993. So why is the Reserve Bank doing this? Well, higher interest rates put downward pressure on inflation by lowering demand in the economy. So why do higher interest rates lower demand in the economy? Well, there are a variety of channels. So firstly, higher interest rates will reduce free cash flow for mortgage holders. Secondly, they raise the cost of borrowing for businesses. When businesses face higher borrowing costs, that disincentivizes them or makes them less likely to want to undertake investment or to expand their businesses. So that will lead to reduced demand. Thirdly, higher interest rates lower the price of assets, such as shares or housing, as you may have read. So house prices have fallen during the interest rate cycle. When people have less wealth, they tend to spend less. That reduces aggregate demand. Fourth, higher interest rates will tend to raise the exchange rate, the Australian dollar, the value of the Australian currency, Australian dollar versus other countries' currencies. That, as a result of raising the Australian dollar, will make our exports more expensive to foreigners and reduce demand for our exports. Conversely, our imports will be cheaper to Australians, and we may substitute towards imports than domestically produced goods. Both goods and services, both those things reduce demand. So we don't know what will happen next. The Reserve Bank meets on the first Tuesday of every month. We'll find out soon what they decide in May. But market economists are generally expecting perhaps one or possibly two more interest rate rises. So what will the effect of those interest rate rises be on the economy? So the RBA is expecting that the large increase in interest rates will lower demand for labour by firms. So firms will reduce their hiring. That will result in a gradual increase in the unemployment rate. What I've shown here is the same graph as before, but I've appended to the end forecasts that are produced by the Reserve Bank of Australia. So by their expectations, by mid-2025, the unemployment rate will, as a result of those interest rate rises, rise from around 3.5% to 4.5%. So roughly a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. That's significant and will result in many people who are currently in work, many new people entering the labour market, having a harder time finding work than they otherwise would have. However, the unemployment rate, even under these projections, will still be at historically low levels. So this is, I think, if this occurs, this will be a good macroeconomic outcome. So that rise in unemployment is expected to put downward pressure on wages. So as an employee, people will be less able to bargain for higher wage rises. That will lower firms' costs, and that in turn will put downward pressure on inflation. Here, again, I've taken the consumer price index, the inflation rate, and I've appended to it in red the Reserve Bank of Australia's forecast for inflation out to mid-2025. And what you can see is they're projecting over that period a fairly sharp slowing in inflation to back towards the top of their target band, or around 3%. So this reflects, as I just described, the rise in the unemployment rate and the reduction in demand, reducing demand-side pressures in the economy and lowering inflation. Also, this slowing in the inflation rate reflects the Reserve Bank of Australia's view that supply disruptions that have affected the economy will continue to dissipate and supply chains ease and become more reliable. Inflation rate will decline. So having now taken a little bit of a tour of the macroeconomic outlook, I want to discuss whether the federal budget position is appropriate in supporting the return to low and stable inflation. So I'm going to draw, in large part for the rest of the talk, on projections that are done by the Parliamentary Budget Office. This is an independent authority of the Australian Parliament, which produces analysis of the budget. Importantly for us, they're going to produce analysis beyond the next 4 years, which is the standard budget horizon, and give us an idea of how things would evolve over the next decade, absent major policy changes or unexpected economic shocks. So this graph here shows the budget position as a percent of GDP. A negative number means a deficit, a positive number means a surplus. In the early 2000s, we had surpluses and have run deficits since. During the global financial crisis in the late 2000s, we entered deficits and remained in deficit. We almost reached surplus just before the pandemic, and then were deep in deficit as a result of the pandemic. Under current policy settings, we're expecting deficits around 2% of GDP over the next decade. So is this appropriate? So it's appropriate for the federal government to run a budget deficit in economic downturn to support aggregate demand. That's exactly what happened during the GFC and the COVID pandemic. But in good times, government should accumulate surpluses and repay debt to build the capacity to support the economy in future downturns. So under current policy settings, the budget, as I mentioned, is expected to be in deficit by around 2% of GDP over the next decade. So reducing the size of the deficit now would restrain demand and assist the task of the Reserve Bank in putting downward pressure on inflation. And so that's something you may hear discussed around the budget. So let's now look in the past how the government's budget deficit has varied over the business cycle. So in this plot, I've got two things. The orange graph is the unemployment rate. That's on the left-hand axis. So you can see we're now around 3.5%. The blue bars represent the budget deficit, so the amount by which government expenses exceed revenues as a share of GDP on the right axis. So reached a peak of over 6% during the pandemic and expected to be a little less than 2% in the current financial year, 2022-23. So what you can see is during the early 1980s and early 1990s recessions, there were big increases in the unemployment rate and the budget moved sharply into deficit. That's appropriate. In bad times, the budget's used to support aggregate demand, as I mentioned. So the fact that the budget moves into deficit reflects two things. It reflects automatic stabilizers in the economy. Those are the operation of existing spending and transfer programs that vary with the business cycle. For example, when the unemployment rate rises, the government will collect less in income tax revenue and it will spend more on unemployment benefit payments. That increases the deficit, and that's appropriate to support aggregate demand. It also reflects discretionary or additional fiscal stimulus programs that governments have engaged in during bad times. So additional, say, infrastructure spending that is timed to coincide with recessions to stimulate demand. You can see now, focusing now on this period in the early 2000s, the unemployment rate fell and was low at historically low levels, and the government accumulated surpluses. Following the global financial crisis, the budget moved into deficit. What is now a little unusual and undesirable is the budget remained in deficit despite the unemployment rate not being at particularly high levels. Currently, the budget's in deficit despite the fact that the unemployment rate is around 50-year low levels. So that then brings us to the question of debt or fiscal sustainability. So we've seen that deficits around 2% of GDP are expected over the next decade under current policy settings. The question you might ask yourself then, are these deficits consistent with fiscal sustainability? They are, if the level of debt is stable or declining relative to the size of the economy. So let's think of the flows that are increasing debt. So every year the budget's in deficit, that will add to the debt level. Furthermore, new debt has to be issued to cover the interest payments on outstanding debt. However, if the budget net of interest payments, which is sometimes called the primary budget balance, is in balance or surplus, and if economic growth is greater than the interest rate on government debt, then the debt to GDP ratio will fall over time. So what does debt sustainability depend on? It depends on three things: the level of interest rates, the rate of economic growth, and the size of the primary budget balance. So the lower are interest rates, the faster is economic growth, and the smaller is the primary budget deficit, or the budget deficit once we exclude interest payments on government debt, the more likely it's the case that our fiscal position is going to be sustainable, or in other words, that the debt relative to the size of the economy is stable or declining. So with that, let's now have a look at the Parliamentary Budget Office's projections under current policy settings for Australia's net debt as a share of the economy. So currently, net debt to GDP is around 25%. It's expected to creep up slightly to around 30% by the end of the next decade. So we've seen a very sharp rise since the mid-2000s, prior to the global financial crisis, when Australia had no net debt. In fact, we've accumulated net assets. But to put things in international perspectives, Australia's level of federal government debt is below the OECD average. So the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, a group of mostly advanced economies, we're low compared to the set of comparable countries, and particularly compared to the US, the UK, Canada, and Japan. So under current policy settings, Australia's debt position appears sustainable over the next decade. Let's have a look at some of the drivers that are affecting the debt to GDP ratio in Australia. So the first one is interest rates. So the government borrows primarily using 10-year bonds. So interest rates and that interest rate that the government borrows at is shown by this graph here. So interest rates on government debt have risen since the pandemic from extraordinarily low levels of at or below 1% to around 3.5%. And that's raising interest expense for the government and putting upward pressure on the debt to GDP ratio compared to when interest rates were lower. Nevertheless, as you can see, compared to the history since 2000 even, interest rates still remain at relatively low levels. So reflecting those greater interest expenses, you can see the greater interest expense, so the dollars that the federal government has to spend each year servicing the stock of debt outstanding is expected to rise. So by the end of the next decade, we're expecting around 1.5% of GDP, interest expense around 1.5% of GDP. So a fairly large and rising share of government's revenues being consumed by paying interest on debt. The third important factor that I highlighted shaping this fiscal sustainability is the level of growth in the economy. So recall that fiscal sustainability depends on the level of debt relative to GDP. So a given debt level is more manageable, the greater is GDP growth. And in particular, it's called nominal GDP growth. So this graph here shows real GDP growth. So growth adjusting for changes in the average price level. And you can see as shown by the orange line, that's averaged around 3.5% over the period since 1980. So if we assume inflation of around 2 to 3% over time, so the Reserve Bank of Australia's target band, that would imply nominal GDP growth is likely to be around 6%. So about 3.5% real growth plus 2.5% nominal growth. So recall before, the interest rate that government's facing on debt that it issues is now around 3.5%. Nominal GDP growth, if it tracks according to history, we could expect to be around 6%. So if nominal GDP growth is greater than the interest rate on government debt, then that is consistent with fiscal sustainability. In fact, if the government was running a primary budget balance, so excluding, so once we abstract from interest expenses, if expenses equal revenues, and it's the case that nominal GDP growth is greater than the interest rate on government debt, then the debt to GDP ratio will decline over time. Notably, we've had some big variation in GDP growth around COVID. Prior to the pandemic, the Australian economy had been growing more slowly than it had in the past. We don't know what will happen into the future, but even if that continues, it's likely the case that nominal GDP growth will exceed the interest rate on government debt as required for Australia's fiscal position to be sustainable. So having discussed fiscal sustainability, what I now want to do is dig a little bit into the drivers of the deficit. So look at revenues and expenses separately. So the blue line shows expenses. So government spending plus transfer payments made by the federal government, and revenues, predominantly tax revenues. The difference, expenses minus revenues, is the budget deficit. So the difference between these two lines is about 2% of GDP out through the projection period. So what you can see is under current policy settings, both expenses and revenues are projected to grow as a share of the economy, and then reach higher levels. Expenses will reach higher levels than they have in the past. Revenues back to levels of the early 2000s. So let's have a look first at the drivers of revenues. So what is contributing to that expected increase in revenues as a percent of GDP under current policy settings? So this graph breaks it down by components, and you can see the biggest increase is personal income tax. Second, that's followed by increases in superannuation fund taxes, and then less than offsetting that is expected to be lower company tax tax collections as a share of GDP, and the sum of all other taxes. So why are personal income taxes expected to rise as a share of the economy under unchanged policy settings? That's largely a result of expected bracket creep. So what is bracket creep? So bracket creep occurs when inflation pushes taxpayers into higher tax brackets, resulting in an increase in their overall tax liability, even if their income has not actually increased in real terms. So if inflation goes up by 5% and I get a 5% higher, I get a 5% wage rise, that may push me into a higher tax bracket and I pay more tax as a share of my income. But in real terms, my pre-tax income is not higher because my wage rose by the same amount as inflation. So to see that over time, looking at the personal income tax component in isolation, this graph shows personal income tax revenue as percent of GDP, and it's expected to rise to around 13%, so to historically high levels. and that is largely a result of bracket creep. You may be wondering what this dip here is out in the forecast period. Remember, the Parliamentary Budget Office make projections based on unchanged, assuming no changes in legislation. There are some tax cuts that are legislated to take effect in the forecast or projection period, and those are the so-called stage 3 tax cuts. So what this shows is the stage 3 tax cuts will reduce somewhat personal income tax collections as a share of the economy, but with bracket creep continuing thereafter, it will be more than offset by the end of the next decade unless further tax cuts are legislated. So absent future policy changes, average personal income tax rates will rise, and income taxes will be a larger share of total revenues. So some of the relative moderation or the relatively modest level of deficits out in the forecast or projection period reflect expected increases in revenues flowing from bracket creep. So next, let's turn to look at what that might mean for Australia's tax structure. So if Australia's would be relying increasingly on personal income taxes to fund government, is that appropriate, and how does it compare to comparable countries? So this table shows Australia's tax structure in 2020. We've got the most recent comparison with the OECD average, and you can see taxes on personal income in Australia are around 40% of total tax revenues in Australia. That's substantially higher to the OECD average. And then under the Parliamentary Budget Office's projections, that will rise. So taxes on personal income in Australia will rise as a share of total tax revenues. So this might, on the surface, seem alarming. However, the big difference between Australia and the OECD average in the share collected on personal income reflects differences in the way we save for our retirement. So in Australia, Australians save mostly through private superannuation accounts rather than government social security taxes. So you can see government social security contributions here, 27% of total taxes for the OECD and 0 for Australia, because we don't have an equivalent. If you make an adjustment to include superannuation, you would for Australia, and if you add those social security taxes, they're called contributions, but they're effectively taxes to the other OECD countries, you end up with Australia and the OECD looking fairly similar in their reliance on personal income taxes. So even if Australia raises more revenue from personal income taxes than it has in the past, we won't be dramatically different to the rest of the OECD. But where does Australia look different? It's important to note. Australia relies substantially less on consumption taxes, so we have a relatively low goods and services tax to other countries, and we rely to a much greater extent on corporate income taxes than other countries. So this, in the high reliance on corporate income taxes, in part reflects large tax collections from mining companies. So we've discussed, I wanted to discuss the drivers behind revenues and expenses of the budget deficit through time. We've talked about the revenue side and the composition of tax revenues. What I want to do lastly is look at the expenditure side. So recall that I showed you that if current policy settings continue unchanged, then it's expected that expenses will grow to their highest level, higher level than they have in the past as a share of GDP. So what's driving that? So this graph shows the major components of government spending and transfer programs. So what are the big increases? There's the National Disability Insurance Scheme stands out, and interest payments on government debt. So what's driving those? So the rise in interest expense reflects expectations that when the government issues new debt, it will face higher interest rates than it had in the past. So some of the debt that's outstanding at the moment that the government will need to roll over in the future They won't be able to borrow at the low interest rates they did, for example, during the pandemic at around 1 to 2%, but they'll be facing higher interest rates. Those higher interest rates, together with a similar or perhaps higher level of debt, will mean a larger share of government expenses going to servicing debt. The NDIS expenses have risen much faster than expected when the program was set up in the early 2010s. So you may have seen commentary in the media about this, and I expect you'll hear a lot more in the budget about efforts to slow the growth in expenses of the NDIS, because it is a significant driver of expenses over time and expected to be unless there are further policy changes. Other things, so the population is aging, so more people will be retired and older, and so that'll lead to an increase in aged care spending and also an increase in pension spending. Among a variety of other categories, there are expected to be some decreases in expenses relative to the size of the economy, but they won't be enough to net off the big rises in age spending, interest expense, and the NDIS. So that concludes my talk. I'm more than happy and very glad to take your questions on any of this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christian, for sharing your insights with us. There's lots of things for us to consider as we go into the budget in 2 weeks' time. I'll now hand over to Darren, who's going to talk about the Bachelor of Economics at the University of Sydney. Thanks, Darren.
Thank you, Charlotte. I would like to acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and the tradition and law of the country in which the University of Sydney campuses stand. I pay respect to those who have cared and continue to care for country. Welcome to our dual degree Sciences Po France presentation. Our dual degree with Sciences Po is a 2+2 4-year dual degree. In years 1 and 2, you will study at Sciences Po's Bachelor of Arts. In years 3 and 4, you will study our Bachelor of Economics or our Bachelor of Arts. Subject to approval by both institutions and subject to the student meeting all relevant admissions and entry requirements, a student who has not yet commenced at USyd but who holds an offer for USyd's Bachelor of Economics program may apply for entry instead into USyd's Bachelor of Arts program, but not vice versa. In the first year of your Sciences Po Bachelor program, you will study economics, history, humanities, law, political science, and sociology. In the second year of your Sciences Po Bachelor program, you will study your major, economy and society, political economy, or humanities, or politics and government. In the third and fourth years of your dual degree, you will study our Bachelor of Economics or Bachelor of Arts. On Friday, 21 April 2023, USyd's Academic Board resolved to approve the following new streams to commence on the 1st of January 2024, meaning the Bachelor of Economics dual degree Sciences Po France requires 144 credit points in total, comprising a 2-year sequence, which will be credited as 48 credit points of study at Sciences Po France, a minimum of 84 credit points from Table A for the Bachelor of Economics, including a program in economics, which is 72 credit points as defined in Table A, 12 credit points of economics, business school, science or engineering elective units from Table S, and where appropriate, elective units from Table A for the Bachelor of Economics or from Table S. Students may complete a second major, 48 credit points, or minor, 36 credit points, as specified from Table A or Table S. But this requirement to complete a second major or second minor is what will be different from next year on. If you choose to do our Bachelor of Arts, this requires now 144 credit points in total, comprising, again, a 2-year sequence, which will be credited as 48 credit points of study from Sciences Po France. A major, 48 credit points as listed and defined and as specified in Table A. Where appropriate, elective units from Table A or Table S. Students may complete a second major, 48 credit points, or minor, 36 credit points, as specified from Table A or Table S. And again, this is a change that was announced last Friday. So you're the first cohort to be hearing this new information, which will be implemented from the 1st of January 2024. If you are a domestic student, you are strongly encouraged to apply for our Sciences Po dual degree scholarship, valued at $15,000 per annum for 2 years, and aimed at providing support to students studying our Sciences Po dual degree who are experiencing disadvantage or hardship. This program is highly competitive. Admission to the program is determined jointly by the University of Sydney and Sciences Po based on the following criteria. You must be a recent high school leaver. You must submit a statement of motivation, CV, and academic transcripts for the last 3 years. If you're invited to, you will need to attend a panel interview via Zoom. Regarding tuition fees, the first tuition fee component is for years 1 and 2 at Sciences Po. Regardless of whether you are a Commonwealth supported student, otherwise known as HEPS, or international full fee paying student, tuition fees are paid directly to Sciences Po. Applications open directly to the University of Sydney on Tuesday 1 August 2023 and close on Tuesday 31 October 2023 for first round and Wednesday 31 January 2024 for second round. You do not apply through UAC for this application. If successful, you will receive enrolment instructions from Sciences Po in May-June 2024 and your studies will commence in August 2024. We encourage you to read other students' experiences through our related articles that have asked questions including what drew students to or made students decide to do the dual degree? What makes the dual degree unique in comparison to other programs? Why should you do the dual degree? What advice would they give to students considering the dual degree? What was their experience of studying with international students in France? And how did the degree prepare students for life after completion? If you would like to connect with us, please see our International Opportunities page or you can email us at fas.international@sydney.edu.au. If your question is not answered live today, please see our dual degrees explained page or you can email us at that address and which will be shown on the screen later in the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Darren, for sharing that with us. That's fantastic. If anyone has any questions, as Darren mentioned, feel free to pop them in the Q&A now and we can answer them live. Otherwise, there's an email address that you can send any questions through to after today's talk. I don't think anything's come through our Q&A chat, so we have some questions here that we'd love Christian and Darren to answer for us. So Christian, I might start with you for the first one. If you can let us know where can studying a degree like economics take you? What are some opportunities that you've had through studying economics, career opportunities, work opportunities, that sort of thing?
Hi, Charlotte. So thank you. I can kick off with that. So in terms of careers that can follow from an economics degree, I think it provides you a toolkit that can provide access to a variety of different careers. So, one option and a common pathway is into the public service. So the public service hires many economists, such as the Reserve Bank of Australia, Treasury, the Federal Treasury and State Treasury departments. Economists are also employed in financial markets to analyze economic and financial data. Economists are also employed in consulting organizations. So consultants use economists to evaluate programs for governments and also for businesses. So a variety of things, and I'd say sort of overlaying that sort of more broadly, what it provides you is an analytical toolkit that can really be, it's quite versatile and it can be applied to a range of different questions.
Thanks so much, Christian. We've got a question that's just come through the Q&A. I'm hoping it's from your presentation. I'm hoping you might be able to answer it. I'll read it out to you. I had a question about the economics talk. Instead of raising taxes to increase revenue, would nationalisation of previously owned federal government companies and other mining companies, let's say, help to increase revenue asset ownership of the government? Could this also not be used to reduce or increase prices based on market fluctuation, but also to provide lower cost product services in order to combat inflation?
Great, thanks for the question. So there are a couple of parts to the question. So in terms of government ownership of assets, one thing that's actually notable is during the period in the early 2000s and the late 1990s, where Australia paid off a lot of debt, is much of that, a substantial part of that debt was paid off through asset sales, so sales of government assets. For example, the sale of Telstra resulted in a large increase, large payment to the federal government, which was used to pay down debt. So of course, offsetting that is reduced flow of revenues to the government that they would have had if they'd continued to own the company. It's not necessarily clear that who owns the asset will have a big effect on the fiscal position over time. So for example, if you sell Telstra now, then you get a big increase in funds, which you can use to pay down debt. But as I mentioned, offsetting that, you reduce revenues. If the government wanted to nationalise assets, they would then now have to go out and buy those assets back off the private sector, which would require issuing a lot of debt. In return for that, they would get a flow of revenues from then public enterprises. Whether that's desirable or not, I think we tend to think the ownership of assets should be determined more on microeconomic grounds. So in other words, who is better able to manage and deliver efficient services. So governments have decided over time that for some assets, such as telecommunications, they're better held in the private sector. Another aspect, I think, of your question that was hinting at is, could we raise more revenue from taxes on mining? So certainly Australia's company tax and some mining royalties by state governments raise a substantial amount of money from mining companies. When the price of commodities goes up, we raise more. And in fact, in this budget cycle, upgrades to expectations for commodity prices will result in an improvement in the expected budget balance. And that's reflected in the numbers that I showed you today. But one thing also to keep in mind is that if Australia is going to fulfill its commitments to reduce the sort of carbon intensity of the economy, we might actually see reduced mining activity over time. And a consequence of that I think your question highlights worth keeping in mind is that would be reduced revenues to the government through existing taxes, and they will need to be made up by other taxes elsewhere. So thanks very much for your question.
Thanks so much, Christian. We might throw to a question to you, Darren. What are some of the areas that students can study in the dual degree in economics?
Thanks, Charlotte. So along with our standalone Bachelor of Economics and Bachelor of Economics and Advanced Studies, students enrolled in our dual degree can also specialise in 4 areas. So we have our econometrics, our actual economics program. They can also do environmental, agricultural and resource economics. And I know we've got, I think, an agricultural high school with us, so that might be of interest to some of our attendees today. And finally, our financial economics. So 4 areas that they can specialise in. And depending on how they make up their degree structure, it is possible to major in 2 of them, or even major in one and minor in the other. So a good range of possibilities that students can study in with a dual degree.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Darren. And I might throw to you, Christian, for our final question. How can students keep up to date with current economic news, and is there anything that we should be particularly looking for in the budget in the next 2 weeks?
Thanks, Charlotte. It's a great question. So I would encourage everyone to try and keep up to date with economics news. So the major newspapers have economics correspondents that monitor and report on our economic data. So for example, on Wednesday, the Consumer Price Index data came out for the March quarter, the 3 months to March. And there were reports of that in major newspapers. So I'd encourage you to read those. In particular, I would suggest you follow the economics correspondence in the major newspapers, such as, for example, in the Sydney Morning Herald, Shane Wright and Ross Gittins write pieces that I think are accessible and will challenge you to think about current economic conditions and policy. For example, the Sydney Morning Herald at the moment has running an excellent series on housing, which I'm sure is something of interest to, what's of interest to everyone, but particularly to young people. So I'd encourage you to read that. You won't necessarily be able, given the tools you've got so far, and you've learned to understand everything that's being discussed, but I think it'll show you how economics is used and how economics informs the policy process and the types of questions that economists are interested in and can answer.
Thanks so much, Christian. That's fantastic. If no one has any more questions to pop into the Q&A, I might just, let's see what's coming through. Darren, this one might be for you. We've just got a question about the dual degree. So someone's asked, can you transfer from doing an arts degree within the dual degree into economics if your ATAR wasn't high enough?
That's a good question. The answer is no, you can't go from a Bachelor of Arts to a Bachelor of Economics, but you can do it the other way if you haven't already started. What you can do, though, through what we call our shared pool, which is our table S in our handbook, you can definitely do an economics major. You can also do those majors that I specified before. So while you may not be doing a Bachelor of Economics per se, you can definitely major in economics for your arts degree. So that is definitely possible.
Thanks so much, Darren. Thanks everyone for all your fantastic questions. I hope we've done our best to answer them today for you. If you do have any other questions, we'll pop an email address through at the end of the slides. Feel free to send us any questions after today, and we'll also send you a recording of this talk series. Just pop on your screen as well to let you know we've got a few Articulate talk series coming up over the next few weeks as well. We've popped a QR code down the bottom for each of them if you'd like to register for them. They all relate to the HSC syllabus, so what you're probably currently studying and preparing for your upcoming trials and HSC exams. So we've got one on religion, English, and if you're studying Spanish continuous and extension, we have an upcoming Articulate talk series on that one. I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone for attending our first Articulate series for 2023 today, and a big thank you to Christian and Darren for joining us and sharing all your insights. It's really fantastic to have you here. And if anyone has any questions after today, please feel free to contact us on either of the email addresses below. So if you want to know more about the dual degree, send an email through to fast.international@sydney.edu.au. And for anything related to any of our high school programs, or if you have any questions after today from the presentation, feel free to email us at fast.partnerships@sydney.edu.au. But again, a big thank you to everyone for joining us, and a big thank you to our presenters, and we hope to see you at another Articulate soon. Thanks everyone, have a great night.